What if the emotions you feel every day aren't actually coming from the present moment? What if most of what you call your personality is really a collection of old reactions, unspoken fears, and forgotten experiences, still living inside your body? This is the quiet truth of being human. You behave in ways that don't always make sense to you, not because you were confused, but because you're finally understanding emotional patterns that have been guiding you for years. Beneath every reaction sits the hidden layers of identity, the parts of you shaped before you were old enough to notice. And between longing for closeness and protecting yourself from it, you'll find the core of your inner conflict. Let's explore the emotional blueprint you've been carrying all along, often without ever realizing it. Most people go through life reacting more than choosing. You probably know this feeling well. Someone says something small, and you suddenly withdraw. A moment feels too intense, and your chest tightens. A tone, a glance, a pause. Something wakes an old emotional memory you never meant to revisit. You don't do this on purpose. These reactions are automatic. They happen before you can think, and sometimes before you even know what you're feeling. Recognition begins the moment you finally notice the pattern. Maybe you say, "Why do I always do this? Why does this tiny thing feel so big? Why did that moment hurt more than it should?" That question, the first moment of awareness, is the doorway to understanding yourself. Think of a recent emotional reaction that surprised you. Did it match the moment, or did it belong to something much older? When something hits too deeply, too quickly, it usually means a part of your emotional past is still living in the present. So, notice which people or situations make you tense. Your patterns reveal themselves through repetition. Recognition doesn't fix anything, but it gives you your first piece of the puzzle. The realization that your emotional world has shape, texture, and history. Everything you feel now began somewhere, not in dramatic events, but in dozens of quiet, repeated moments. In childhood, you learn emotional rules long before you understand them. Maybe affection felt inconsistent. Maybe silence felt safer than honesty. Maybe big emotions made the room feel heavy. Maybe being too much or too honest caused tension. Maybe your needs felt like burdens. Small patterns become survival strategies, and survival strategies become adulthood behavior. Now, think of a sentence you heard often growing up, about crying, anger, independence, or needing help. Does that sentence still guide how you act today? Children don't analyze their feelings. They adapt to keep love, safety, and stability. And the ways you adapted then often shape how you connect, withdraw, trust, or hide now. This is how unconscious patterns begin. The habit of staying quiet, the instinct to pull back, the belief that closeness is fragile, the fear that emotions push people away, the tension between wanting connection and fearing it. These old emotional lessons become the hidden script of adulthood. So, ask yourself, what emotion was not allowed in my home? Adults struggle most with the feelings they were taught to suppress. Origins aren't about blame, they're about context. And context gives you compassion for the emotional patterns you once judged so harshly in yourself. Emotions don't come out of nowhere. They are shaped by the brain's attempt to protect you. Humans are wired for pattern recognition. If something hurt you once, an argument, rejection, abandonment, emotional neglect, your nervous system prepares for that pain again, even when nothing dangerous is happening. This is predictive processing, your brain expecting old pain in new situations. It shows up as hyper-awareness of people's moods, tension in calm moments, expecting loss too quickly, trusting slowly, pulling away before you get hurt, assuming kindness won't last. You are not overreacting. You are protecting yourself with information from the past. Think of someone who treated you well. Did you relax into it, or did you wait for the moment it would change? Humans often mistrust what they didn't grow up with. If chaos was normal, calm feels suspicious. If affection was inconsistent, stability feels unreal. The body doesn't believe what it hasn't experienced consistently. This is why understanding emotional patterns is so powerful. It lets you separate past danger from present safety. When your reaction feels fast, it's probably old. When your fear feels vague, it's usually not about the current person. When you shut down, ask, what story is my body replaying? Your emotions make sense. They always have. You just needed the language to understand them. There is a moment in almost every human life when wanting and fearing happen at the same time. You want closeness, but you fear depending on someone. You want honesty, but you hide the pieces of yourself you think are too much. You want to be seen, but being seen feels risky. This tension is the heart of being human. It's not confusion, it's protective instinct. Inner conflict develops when two emotional truths collide. I want to be close, and closeness has hurt me. So you do things without understanding why. You distance yourself. You test people. You assume the worst. You leave first. You stay silent even when you want connection. You convince yourself you're fine alone. Or you attach too quickly, afraid the moment will disappear. Think of a relationship, romantic or not, where you felt overwhelmed by your own emotions. Was the intensity coming from the present moment, or from something earlier? Inner conflict is the result of living between two worlds, the world where you long for connection, and the world where you learn to protect yourself from it. You're not broken for feeling this way. You're simply human, trying to trust, trying to stay open, trying to learn a new emotional language. Change doesn't begin with action. It begins with noticing. You realize your withdrawal is a reflex. Your silence is protection. Your tension is memory. Your overthinking is survival. Your suspicion is a leftover defense. Awareness interrupts the autopilot. It gives you enough space to ask, is this reaction from my present or my past? The turning point is small but powerful. You pause, you breathe, you watch your pattern instead of obeying it. Imagine the last time you shut down emotionally. What feeling were you trying to avoid? Embarrassment, rejection, disappointment, or vulnerability? This tiny moment of clarity creates a tiny moment of choice. And that's how emotional patterns begin to loosen. You don't need to change the emotion, just notice it. Awareness gives you enough distance to choose a new response. Even 1 second of recognition counts. The turning point is the beginning of a new emotional experience, where your past can inform you, without controlling you. Integration is not a transformation you can see. It's something you feel subtly over time. You speak more honestly. You react more slowly. You understand your triggers without judgment. You allow yourself to feel things you once suppressed. You no longer confuse old fears with present danger. You no longer assume people will leave without reason. You no longer treat connection as a risk, but as something you can navigate thoughtfully. Integration is the stage where everything becomes clearer. Who you are, what you need, what you fear, and how you want to love. Think of a moment when you felt emotionally safe with someone. Who did you become in that space? That version of you is real, not the fear, not the defenses. Safe relationships reveal your true emotional capacity. You don't need to fix yourself, only understand yourself. Slowly, you become someone who responds with awareness instead of instinct. Someone who sees their patterns and chooses connection anyway. By the end of this journey, you begin to realize something simple but profound. You have always been understandable. Your patterns came from somewhere. Your fears had reasons. Your defenses had purpose. Your inner conflict made sense. Being human has always been a poetic experience. Not dramatic, not perfect, just beautifully unfinished. You carry longing and fear in the same heart. You desire closeness and protect yourself from it. You seek truth but fear being seen. You grow from the same memories that once hurt you. You are not defined by your emotional patterns. You are defined by your ability to understand them. This is the quiet, gentle truth at the core of your life. You can be complex and still lovable. You can be afraid and still worthy of connection. You can carry old pain and still create new safety. You can know your patterns and still outgrow them. This is the poetry of being human, a soft, ongoing evolution toward clarity, compassion, and deeper self-understanding. A story written in emotions you're only now beginning to name. If this gave you language for feelings you've carried for years, subscribe. We explore the emotions people rarely talk about, but everyone feels. And comment below what part of the video felt like it was about you. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.